Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 44 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today, we will explore the history of vegetarianism in the United States. It's a fascinating story, but I feel a bit weird introducing it because I've just returned from 2 trips down south, one trip to Raleigh, North Carolina, and the other to Fort Worth, Texas. And in both places, I ate a lot of meat. I went to Raleigh to attend the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic conference, and I went to Fort Worth to attend Podcast Movement, which is the world's largest podcast conference. Both conferences were fantastic. I came home with many ideas about the types of historical work historians are pursuing and ways I can integrate that work into my own historical studies, and I also came home with tips about how I can improve as a podcaster and help us connect more history lovers to Ben Franklin's World. And I'm really looking forward to getting right to work on all those tips. With that said, I am the type of tourist who eats my way through a new place. Yep, I love experiencing culture, and my favorite part of that culture is usually the food. In North Carolina, I learned what a meat and 3 is. It's a meal that consists of a meat, there's usually like a meat of the day on the menu, and 3 fixins. Now, that's fixins, not fixings, and it's not sides as we would say in the Northeast. Fixins consist of yummy starches or vinegar-soaked vegetables. It was awesome. In Texas, I enjoyed a lot of Tex-Mex. In fact, my dining choices in Texas were a case of be careful what you wish for, because just before I left, I told Tim, boy, I really hope I get a chance to eat great Tex-Mex while I'm in Texas. Well, I ate out with a bunch of podcaster and historian friends while in Fort Worth, and each of the 4 nights I was there, we went to a restaurant where the only choice was Tex-Mex. With that said, the food is great, although the first 2 nights I was a bit perplexed by the fact that one does not simply eat beef or pork tacos. In Texas, there are actually options for what type of beef or pork you want to eat. Okay, enough about food, because now that I've made you and me hungry, we should probably turn our attention to today's guest, Adam Shprintzen, vegetarian and author of The Vegetarian Crusade, The Rise of an American Reform Movement, 1817 to 1921. During our conversation, Adam takes us through the origins of the vegetarian movement in the United States, the evolution of the movement, which includes its transition from Proto Vegetarianism, vegetarianism with a small v, and vegetarianism with a capital V, and vegetarians' ideas about how they wish to effect total social reform during the mid to late early Republic period. I think I can hear your stomach growling, so we had better get to our conversation with Adam. Wait, no, I think that's my stomach growling.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Adam Shprintzen is an assistant professor of history at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. His research interests include the history of 19th century American culture and reform movements. These interests led him to write his book, The Vegetarian Crusade, The Rise of an American Reform Movement, 1817 to 1921. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz.
Now, one fact I omitted from Adam's bio is that he is a self-described, quote, nearly obsessive baseball fan, end quote. And I bring this up because I am also a nearly obsessive baseball fan. In fact, I'm probably not nearly, I am obsessive.
I would agree on that front.
But I really wanted to point this out because it shows you the lengths I will go to bring you the most interesting and intriguing early American history out there. I am a diehard Red Sox fan, and Adam is a Yankees fan, and I knew this before I invited him on the show.
The good thing is that my proclivities towards New York baseball hopefully do not ruin my scholarship towards New England and the whole Northeast as a body, since it's such an important part of my book.
Oh, you're speaking our language, huh, Adam?
I try.
It's all right.
I think there may be some dirty water somewhere within the Vegetarian Crusade, so we'll run with it.
And Dirty Water, of course, is the song that the Red Sox play after every home win, so that's an apt reference. But aside from your interest in the New York Yankees, would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to write about the history of vegetarianism in the United States?
Absolutely. So my background is in 19th century American history as well as public history. And that background, my graduate studies at Loyola University of Chicago, led me down the path towards looking at this really interesting and often kind of overlooked time period of culinary history in the United States, especially as it relates to those who chose to abstain from eating meat. But what's really kind of interesting is that it started really kind of simply and in a really sort of innocuous type of way. I was in a graduate seminar, a reading course on sort of the great works of 19th century American history. And in that class, we were reading a book by Helen Horowitz called Rereading Sex. And it's a book that basically talks about the different ways in which American reformers dealt with issues of sexuality and sex in the 19th century, right? We have this very solid sense popularly that the 19th century is this Victorian era, especially, say, from the 1830s all the way into the end of the 19th century, that it's a Victorian era and people are very buttoned up and there's self-control, and that sex is something to be sort of controlled and subsided. And Horowitz's book sort of throws this idea onto its head and says that there are lots of different people with lots of different ideas around sex, and one of the groups of people that she talks about are medical practitioners or medical theorists of the time period. And in this book, there's a really brief, maybe a paragraph-long mention of the fact that there are vegetarians in the 19th century. And kind of coincidentally, at the same time, I had just converted to a vegetarian diet. We're going on about 10 years now. And so I had an interest in trying to explore this topic. So it started really simply with a seminar paper on this history in graduate school. And soon after that, I needed a topic for a dissertation, so it eventually evolved into a dissertation, and the dissertation eventually evolved into a book. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, even at the time, and still do today, is that if you were to undergo a significant lifestyle change or conversion, whether it was, say, a political ideal, religious adherence, all these identities that we think are important or that we adhere to as if they're important, there's a good chance that we would have known what the history of those movements are, right? You wouldn't change political parties without having some sort of sense of what that political party's history is, what its ideas are, and so forth. And I realized kind of quickly that I embraced a vegetarian diet without knowing much about its history, especially in the United States. And as somebody who was interested in becoming a professional historian, that kind of struck me as strange that even I would make this change without really knowing the history, especially as it relates to the country that I tend to study. So with that background, I kind of just headed down this path and was lucky that there was just lots of untreaded ground on this history that many people have kind of ignored, and those who had previously researched it or written about it had kind of put vegetarians in the 19th century into the dustbin of quackery or faddism, and discounted their ideas and thoughts precisely because of these ideas that are kind of unhelpful from a historian standpoint.
Adam just noted something he notes in his book, The Vegetarian Crusade, too, which is that vegetarianism isn't a modern-day occurrence. Americans began abstaining from meat in the United States in the early 19th century. Adam, would you tell us how and when vegetarianism got its start in the United States?
So the real start of vegetarianism as a movement in the United States dates itself to 1817. This isn't to say that there wasn't anyone in the United States in the early 19th century or in colonial America who abstained from meat. There's some people who did it because of ideological reasons. There's some people who did it out of sheer necessity. They just couldn't afford meat. But the roots of what I call the vegetarian movement, right, this larger kind of community that evolves over the 19th century over the shared idea of not eating meat, really does date itself to 1817 with the arrival of a group of migrants from Liverpool known as the Bible Christians. The Bible Christians were originally an offshoot of another sort of small sect of Christians in England known as the Swedenborgians, who were Christian mystics that practiced meat abstention. And under the leadership of an individual by the name of William Metcalf, the Bible Christians arrive in the United States in 1817 in Philadelphia. It's incredible that this movement that today we consider to be fairly well accepted, or at least within certain margins of society, in the United States, at least, it actually starts with only 41 individuals that migrate into Philadelphia from Liverpool. And of that 41, about half of them leave the church immediately upon making their way into America. Fairly problematic. In fact, some of the Bible Christians actually decide to start eating meat on the boat when they're going across the Atlantic. So not exactly the type of start that the Bible Christians foresaw for themselves in America. But they established themselves with about half their members, actually 17 at the time that they finally make their way into Philadelphia. And it's a small sort of insular group at first. And in fact, leaders of the Bible Christian Church are kind of met with calls of heresy in the streets of Philadelphia. There's one newspaper that has this great quote about the Bible Christians where another competing mainline Christian accuses the Bible Christians of being wolves in sheep's clothing, right? That they're there preaching about the gospel, and yet clearly there's something behind that that is malicious and not to be trusted. But steadily the organization grows. They start to use the printed word as a way to get their message out. So by 1821, Metcalf publishes what is ostensibly the first book advocating for vegetarianism in the United States. It's called Bible Testimony on Abstinence from the Flesh of Animals. He basically argues in this book that the biblical banning against killing includes all animals, not just humans. They start to grow, gain some converts from outside of their own community. They build a church building by 1823, and in 1830 they're actually incorporated and recognized by the Pennsylvania state legislature.
Are the Bible Christians Proto Vegetarians? I mean, you made a distinction in the Vegetarian Crusade between Proto Vegetarians, Vegetarians, and then Vegetarians with the capital V. Could you describe what each of those different forms of vegetarians are?
That is a really important distinction. I mean, the word vegetarian isn't one that is used sort of en masse in the United States until 1850. It adhered to a little bit earlier than that in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, the word vegetarian is only gains popular use by 1850 with the forming of the first national vegetarian organization in America. So all activities kind of before the 1850s, and this causes certain linguistic problems, right? Vegetarian does mean, a diet based on vegetables. So we can refer to these people as vegetarians. But in the book, I try to avoid that because vegetarian with a capital V refers specifically to this identity that forms around the idea of abstaining from meat. So these very early groups, especially the Bible Christians, are what I do label as proto-vegetarian, in the sense that they adhere to this diet that becomes a marker of the vegetarian movement. But they are sort of precursors to this formalized movement and community that grows throughout the United States. So it shows their influence, but also shows that they are somewhat distinct from what we would know as the vegetarian movement in America.
So is that 1850 mark when vegetarian for religious reasons kind of transforms into the vegetarian movement with the capital V and the capital M?
I think that probably would be the point in time to sort of demarcate. Now, it's not as neat and clean as 1850, in the sense that once this movement is formed, that is the absolute movement of kind of cutting off from a religious past. It's more gradual. So even by the 1830s, right, as the Bible Christians start to expand their message through the printed word outside of the walls of their own church, we see that individuals start to experience the idea of meat abstention and apply it in different ways. Some of those ways are religious in motivation, but some are very much not religious. So, for example, by 1837, you see the rise of physiologists starting to really emphasize the medical and health benefits of vegetarianism. An organization by the name of the American Physiological Society is formed in Boston in 1837 under the auspices of William Alcott, a distant cousin of Louisa May. And Alcott and the physiologists sort of focus in on the reasons why vegetarianism are beneficial for personal health. They say that it is essentially a diet that not only promotes personal health, but that personal health helps create sort of moral health. Well, how? The idea is that a meat-based diet is a diet based in violence and bloodshed and anger, right? The very process of providing meat to individuals is one wrought with violence and bloodshed. As a result, physiologists and other proto-vegetarians believe that that is only going to imbue sort of thoughts and actions of violence and cruelty. So, for example, physiologists and other proto-vegetarians argue that only in a world where individuals are blind to the effects of a violent diet upon themselves could they also be blind to the effects of the slave system on fellow human beings. So we see very early on, even in the 1830s, that there's this kind of endemic connection between the burgeoning vegetarian movement, connections between sort of personal health reform and the ways in which personal health reform can also theoretically create social reform for society at large.
Yeah, it seems like if you have a movement, you have a mission of some sort, and the vegetarians want some sort of social reform. Would you tell us about the social reform that they sought in American society?
So the vegetarians have a very wide-ranging approach towards social reform. They see the vegetarian diet as being sort of the vehicle for total social reform. Well, what was total social reform? Essentially focusing on four main ideals or principles. And this is one evolution that essentially hits on all sort of proto-vegetarian groups, the Bible Christians as well as the physiologists and some others. So, for example, I just mentioned abolitionism, right? The idea is that meat created cruelty within individuals because the meat itself was produced by cruel means. The idea behind this theory was that a vegetarian diet would kind of provide clear moral thought and the ability to sort of understand the inherent immoral nature of the slave system. And once each individual was able to clearly see that this system was cruel and immoral, that this would lead to prompt individuals towards action. In addition to abolitionism, we certainly see the connection between vegetarianism and women's rights. So early vegetarians and proto-vegetarians innately sort of link the idea that meat preparation is, for one thing, long and arduous, which means that women are spending time in the kitchen rather than becoming involved in more intellectually stimulating activities. So on one hand, the idea is that a move away from a meat-based diet would literally liberate women from time spent in the kitchen, but also that preparing meat is sort of unbecoming. So there is certainly a level of glorifying femininity that is going on here, right? That women are too genteel to be dealing with something as visceral as touching bloody, raw meat. What we also see is that there's two other kind of principles that really tie together with the vegetarian movement in the early 19th century, and that's pacifism. This one probably makes the most sense at first glance, right? That violent diets make violent people, so inevitably a collective turn away from a violent diet could create sort of more peaceful individuals, less apt to want to go to war. But what we see with the vegetarians that's a little bit different from sort of traditional pacifists of this time period is that rather than kind of aiming their goals towards governmental institutions, vegetarians say that reform starts within the self and that a collective change amongst humanity in terms of diet can lead to a collective sort of change in terms of society's relationship with warfare. And lastly is the idea of kind of economic equity. Vegetarians essentially argue that raising and slaughtering animals was a really expensive undertaking, which in some ways makes sense, right? They make the argument that instead of feeding animals grains and other vegetarian goods, right, so you have to then buy the feed for the livestock, you also have to buy and take care of the livestock, that instead of spending it on both ends, why not just spend your money on vegetarian goods as well as grains, fruits and vegetables, and eat them yourself? It kind of cuts out half of that sort of process. This would theoretically lead to an increased amount of economic equity across society.
So vegetarians were anti-slavery, pro-women's rights, they were nonviolent, and they want better economic equality. How does all of this lead them to form the American Vegetarian Society, the official society for the vegetarian reform movement? Because it actually seems like the AVS grows out of these four different reform movements.
Absolutely. The American Vegetarian Society, which is first formulated in 1850 is kind of the culmination of all these activities by proto-vegetarian groups. So that would be the Bible Christians, the physiologists, the Grahamites, the followers of Sylvester Graham, as well as some water curists, individuals who focus in on the idea of kind of internal and external cleansing as a way to promote personal health. And the AVS gives voice to this new movement of unifying these very sort of disparate groups, because in some ways, while they are connected by common social reform ideals, they are disparate within their approach to social reform. So the AVS holds its first meeting in New York City in 1850. It's the annual gathering of important vegetarians around the United States. So just from a standpoint of promoting a community beyond the local sort of barriers, the annual meetings of the AVS bring together individuals from all sort of geographic points in the United States to meet based on this idea of vegetarianism. And at these meetings, speeches are given which explicitly connect meat abstention with all these social reform ideals, such as abolitionism and women's rights. And what the AVS also does is two things. First, it promotes and publishes the first vegetarian periodical in the United States, the American Vegetarian and Health Journal. And what it also does is consciously separates itself from these previous ideologies that held true and represented the principle of meat abstention. So, for example, the American Vegetarian Health Journal, upon the death of Sylvester Graham, runs a series of articles that kind of calls into question Graham's lifestyle choices. Now, Graham was, in many ways, the most prominent meat abstainer in the United States until 1850, and was involved in the very process of formulating the American Vegetarian Society. And yet this series of articles basically calls Graham to be a little bit of a hypocrite, that he was too nervous, that he exhausted himself, and, get this, at the end of his life, even decided to try eating meat as a last-ditch effort to save his failing health. So the vegetarians, as they formulate into a movement, really push one of their progenitors under the bus in order to build this new kind of unified ideology and movement.
I have more questions about the movement, but we need to take a little break here and talk about Sylvester Graham. You've already told us who he was and how he was a progenitor of the vegetarian movement, but I need to know more about his bread. Graham crackers. We know them, we love them. Are they really like history cookies? Are these like miniature Graham breads?
You know, we have two children, and graham crackers play an important part of our everyday existence now. The short answer to that is no. The graham crackers that we all know and love and associate with the s'more is a very far trip away from the graham bread that starts to proliferate in the United States in the 1830s. Graham himself started as a lay Presbyterian minister and was really focused in on the temperance movement as of the early 1830s. He goes around preaching against the evils of alcohol. Sometime in that same year, he comes in contact with members of the Bible Christian Church, and unfortunately the historical record is a little bit unclear on this. He begins a correspondence with William Metcalf that supposedly lasts for their lives, but this correspondence has just been lost to history, so nobody knows exactly what's in it. But he meets these Bible Christians, and it certainly has an impact on his ideals regarding diet, beyond just abstinence from alcohol. In 1832, he gets his real sort of push towards popularity. There's a massive cholera outbreak throughout the United States. And he goes on a lecture tour where he essentially says that this idea of overstimulation, the notion that Americans are kind of overtaxed and just drunk in stimulants, whether it's alcohol, coffee, spices, meat being at the center of this as well, is essentially the cause of the massive number of deaths connected to cholera. So Graham basically tells Americans to look at their diets and preaches the notion of meat abstention, and he also preaches over the idea that the most pure, simple, and healthy bread is unbolted wheat bread. What does that mean? During this time period, by the 1830s, the United States has expanded out towards the West, into the Midwest, which means that grains have become more abundant and cheaper. And now individuals aren't necessarily baking their bread at home. They're buying it from a local baker. The local baker had gotten their grain at market, and often in order to keep prices down for this bread, the outer casing of the wheat was bolted off using chemicals such as chlorine, and this is how you produced batches of white bread during the time period. Graham launches these invectives against white bread. He says that it's impure, that it's created for profit rather than health and rather than for personal uplift. And he essentially focuses in on this idea that a turn back towards healthy whole wheat bread, which, by the way, had to be left sitting out for 24 hours before consumption, so it's not exactly the freshest bread after it's been baked, that by using this whole wheat bread that hasn't been bolted and has been created with care and compassion is a way to ensure health, prosperity, and longevity. The graham cracker that we know and love today is essentially a more modern invention of the 1890s. It's interesting that biscuit companies of the time period in the 1890s, the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, sort of at the height of this, attached the Graham name to this product that in many ways does not resemble Graham, and almost always does not resemble Graham bread. In fact, if you look at the ingredients on a box of Graham crackers today, you'll see cinnamon, you'll see sugar, and these are all stimulants that Graham would have preached against as being overtaxing and overstimulating on the body. Still, it makes for a good story.
It does make for a good story, and at first I thought we were going on a tangent here, which was my fault. But actually, looking at the life of Sylvester Graham really brings home the ideas you talked about. He is for better economic equality. He wants to see compassion. He wants to see improved health through better eating. So that example gives us a better idea of what types of people were vegetarians. And along those lines, I wonder if you could talk about the demographics of the American vegetarian societies to bring this back to our earlier conversation. Were vegetarians more likely to live in certain regions or locations of the country? Were they more likely to have a certain economic background more than others?
So most vegetarians during this time period are certainly geographically oriented to the Northeast, and that's true from the first settlements of Bible Christians stretching all the way through the activities of the American Vegetarian Society, although eventually that spreads further west as the 19th century moves on. But it's definitely a northeastern-centric movement with little pockets here and there in the west. So, for example, Oberlin College in 1832 in Ohio actually embraces a Grahamite diet and bans all use of meat in dining halls on campus, and this lasts all the way until 1841. One of Graham's followers worked at Oberlin at the time. But evidence certainly points to the idea that the AVS and that vegetarianism in general was certainly a northern-centric movement and a northeastern-centric movement, with these kind of small pockets in the South as well as in the West. So if you start looking at correspondence in the American Vegetarian Health Journal, letters that are sent, you do see some letters pop up from states in the South, although when that does happen, the letter writers are very sure to express the fact that their idea is not one that is embraced en masse throughout the South. And this isn't a surprise, right? That if vegetarianism, if this diet is so harshly associated, either positively or negatively, depending on your perspective at the time, if it's so associated with this reform ideology, one that absolutely rejects the slave system, that this is an ideology that would be particularly seen as threatening and controversial in the South. That's not to say that controversy and that rejection is only centered in the South. In fact, throughout the North, vegetarians constantly meet with sort of angry responses. And in some ways, those angry responses are related to the fact that vegetarians are rejecting deeply held sort of culinary ideals that placed meat as an important part of a diet. But a lot of it is precisely because they have this total reform ideology, and one that certainly rubbed many people the wrong way based on their own sort of politics or ideals.
You've mentioned numerous times that vegetarians are into a nonviolent lifestyle, that they're very much anti-slavery. They don't eat meat. How did these people live and cope through the Civil War? Because, I mean, it's been a while since I studied the Civil War, but if it's anything like the War for Independence, they're eating salt pork, salt beef, and like hardtack for their meals. So it's not just the fact that there's all this violence in the war. It's the fact that if you're in the army, you're violating another one of your tenets. How did people weather this?
And in many ways, that's very representative of the split that the Civil War kind of creates for the vegetarian movement, or less than a split, more than sort of a disconnecting moment. So that, in fact, the issue of slavery and the abolition of slavery becomes such an important ideal and value to vegetarians that it kind of pushes vegetarianism as an identity or as an action or as a movement kind of into the background. The most distinct sort of way that vegetarians interacted with the Civil War actually dates a few years before that. In 1855, an individual by the name of Henry S. Clubb, who was actually the British migrant to the United States, a Bible Christian, and Clubb, who had immigrated to the United States and started working as a reporter, reporting on events in Kansas, actually decides to formulate a colony in pre-state Kansas in these years that have become known as Bleeding Kansas since then. So it's fairly remarkable. You have this group of vegetarians heading out into sort of the great unknown in 1855 to build this settlement. They're one of many sort of social reform groups that are heading out during this time period. Right, Kansas is sort of up for grabs between pro and anti-slavery forces, and if you win the demographic war of getting more anti-slavery folks out there, then theoretically Kansas should enter into the Union as a free state. Well, Clubb's settlement is one of the attempts for vegetarians to kind of put their philosophies into action. And while the settlement itself disbands fairly quickly, like within a year, they very quickly kind of succumb to the harsh climate. There's real sort of health problems, not to mention the fact that since they're off the banks of a river, there's mosquitoes sort of everywhere and just all the sort of diseases that mosquitoes could spread. And while the settlement disbands, we see that vegetarian members of that colony remain in Kansas and become kind of intricately involved in the push towards war and eventually just join up and start fighting. So Clubb, for example, a pacifist, a vegetarian, ends up serving as a quartermaster during the war. And yet there's this real irony that gets at sort of this tearing philosophical battle within himself. That Clubb is serving as a quartermaster, right? He's literally arming people. And yet, through his war service, he held no weapon. So he's trying to kind of toe this strange line between pacifism as well as the kind of logistics of dictating a war. From a dietary standpoint, it's interesting. Clubb actually writes in a series of letters to his wife that at one point he essentially has to eat a little bit of meat just because conditions have gotten so sort of harsh in terms of food sources. But otherwise, it seems like he continues to adhere to his diet. There are other vegetarians who become really sort of taken with the idea of taking up arms and the slave system. So, for example, James H. Holmes would later become the territorial secretary to New Mexico in 1861. Holmes actually joins with John Brown and fights to defend abolitionist settlements in Kansas starting in 1857. So for some people, they see, and Holmes eventually joins the Union Army as well. So for some vegetarians, they see very little kind of conflict between their ideals of pacifism and the notion that the slave system needs to be ended and needs to be ended immediately. And then others like Clubb really sort of struggle with this idea and don't necessarily come up with a nice and clean type of resolution, but kind of embody the complications and contradictions that this means for vegetarianism.
I know we love to make generalizations, but Clubb and Holmes show us that the choice is really individual and it varies as to how the Civil War and vegetarianism and coping with anti-slavery beliefs would affect a vegetarian.
Absolutely. And these choices have larger sort of implications, right? Clubb becomes kind of intricately involved in sort of the building of the Union war machine, and that's not necessarily something that he feels uncomfortable with. But on a personal level, right, he has real sort of objections to the idea that he himself could become violent. Now, his role in the army certainly makes it less likely that he's going to be involved himself in violent acts. And yet again, he's still able to kind of find a way to compensate within his mind that, okay, I can support these people by doing my job, yet I cannot bring myself to actually take up arms to try to harm another human being. It's a real tension, it's a real contradiction. In many ways, the Civil War helps turn vegetarianism away from its more pacifistic and kind of peaceful past.
Earlier, we discussed the life of Sylvester Graham and the role he played in the early vegetarian movement and pushing that along. after the Civil War, there's another big person who comes along to help push the movement and actually tries to help it become more accepted and mainstream in American society. And that was John Harvey Kellogg. So, Adam, would you tell us about Kellogg, the Battle Creek system, and how Kellogg and his system led to the commercialization of vegetarianism after the Civil War?
So Kellogg represents this new vegetarianism that pops up in the 1880s but really takes hold in the 1890s in the United States. And the new vegetarianism and the new vegetarian is celebrated beyond just sort of the small pockets of vegetarians in the United States, but even by normative society. And it's celebrated as a path towards social success, economic success, physical strength, and achievement. And this all kind of comes out of this small sort of center in Michigan in Battle Creek, right? This is vegetarianism's center starting to move further west. And at Battle Creek, Kellogg was the head of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was essentially two things. One, it was one place that people went to for medical treatment, and that was either for a specific injury. Kellogg himself was a very accomplished surgeon. So he kind of toes this line between someone who has real medical credentials, but his focus in on things like vegetarianism makes him sort of atypical for the medical establishment of the time period. The Battle Creek system essentially said that disease or pain was the body's way of expressing that something was out of whack. And how did you treat that? Well, the treatment varied from person to person, but there were some sort of core elements. One would be exercise, another would be fresh air, right? Sort of preventative types of treatments that we would see today. Swedish massage would be part of that as well. But the one component of the Battle Creek system that was non-negotiable, at least while you were staying in Battle Creek, and for many people this was a vacation in a way, it's kind of resortish. The one component of the Battle Creek system that was non-negotiable was vegetarianism. The Battle Creek Sanitarium draws a laundry list of sort of prominent individuals of the time period, people like Mary Todd Lincoln, Thomas Edison, Sojourner Truth. They all have a stay at Battle Creek at one point, but it's also a location that really appeals to the burgeoning and growing middle class that has disposable income. And what are you going to do with your disposable income? Well, you're going to go on a vacation. So in some ways, Battle Creek is a bit of a tourist attraction for rest and recuperation, and that rest and recuperation can better prepare you for a really sort of competitive world that is growing in the 1890s. What we see is that the Battle Creek Sanitarium also develops its own experimental kitchen, where they're trying to figure out ways to make a vegetarian diet more appealing to their guests, and then also to sell those products outside the walls of Battle Creek. And they developed a series of meat substitutes in this experimental kitchen. This is a massive sort of change from a culinary standpoint for vegetarians. Earlier generations, like Sylvester Graham or William Alcott, basically assailed meat and all of its qualities, its scent, its taste, its blood, things like that. And these meat substitutes that were created at Battle Creek and then marketed throughout the country were promoted precisely because they theoretically looked like meat, smelled like meat, and tasted like meat. This is a fairly massive change in terms of vegetarianism's relationship with meat. It's a more sort of accommodationist view of meat, that it had qualities that individuals should look up to, including what they called blood-making properties, which is essentially protein. And what we also see is that the development of these products, the most popular one known as Protos, marks a shift for vegetarianism towards commercialization. And this is essentially the death knell of the vegetarian movement's connections with political and social reform focus in the United States. It essentially becomes a commercialized type of movement by the turn of the 20th century.
If I recall correctly, I believe I saw a tweet that you had actually made Protos at one point. Is that true?
That is absolutely true.
So does it look like meat, smell like meat, and taste like meat, Adam?
That is a great question. You know, I would say probably not, although it had been a few years since I had eaten meat when I did come up with this concoction. I don't think that it necessarily smelled like meat or tasted like meat. It honestly tasted a little bit more just kind of peanut buttery, because nuts are at the center of these meat substitutes. But what I can say is that it certainly looked like meat. It kind of looked like canned meat when you first made it and before you baked it. And that's how it was shipped. It was shipped in 12-ounce tin cans across the country. And while it may not have legitimately tasted like meat or smelled like meat, producing it was a really fascinating project because it did make me kind of see how this would have been a real sort of step forward culinarily for vegetarians away from sort of the boiled vegetables of the past. And you can kind of see why this would have had greater appeal to those who would maybe want to become vegetarians, but be afraid that their dietary choices were becoming really limited.
Before we move on to the time warp, one last question, and this is a listener question from Christian, and I think it'll actually help us cap off how this later 19th century movement really became commercialized. So Christian would like to know whether the 19th century reformers thought about the effects of meat on the human body. And this seemed like an awesome place for you to talk about the contents in your chapter called Muscular Vegetarianism.
It seems maybe like an anachronism even to our modern ears, although today we see lots of athletes adhering to a vegetarian or vegan diet, so maybe there is some modern relevance here too. But this is a great question. The debate around the effects of meat on the human body is one that informs basically the vegetarian movement throughout its existence in the 19th century. But there is, as you noted, a really kind of massive shift, right? The early vegetarians and Proto Vegetarians focus in on meat having a negative effect on the human body that creates immoral individuals, violent individuals, cruel individuals. Now that you have a commercialized vegetarian movement at the end of the 19th century, spurred by these events in Battle Creek and this kind of larger commercialization of vegetarianism, the movement is really focused in on the diet as a direct route to creating really strong, muscular, and healthy bodies. So you see bodybuilders of the time period starting to embrace vegetarianism, perhaps most prominently an individual by the name of Bernard McFadden, who's the publisher of Physical Culture magazine. And McFadden, while he kind of vacillates on his dietary choices from time to time, at some points he eats meat, at some points he doesn't. He tries fasting diets, things like that. But he certainly uses the pages of Physical Culture magazine to promote vegetarianism as a route towards building really sort of almost, kind of comedically muscular bodies of the time period. You see, for example, the University of Chicago's football team in 1907 decides to collectively adhere to a vegetarian diet because their coach, Amos Alonzo Stagg, a very famous and important figure in standardization of college football, was a vegetarian for a time, and Stagg essentially ensures that his players adhere to a vegetarian diet during this 1907 season. And it seems to have worked because the University of Chicago football team actually won their division that season.
Let's move on to the time warp. This is a fun segment of this show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Adam, in your opinion, what might have happened if John Harvey Kellogg had not created his experimental kitchen and commercialized non-meat products? Do you think vegetarianism would have faded away before the turn of the 20th century?
I don't think that vegetarianism would have faded away. The idea still would have existed, and a movement certainly would have still existed. But it certainly would have been far less embraced by society at large. What's kind of interesting here is that we can actually look to the UK for a model of what could have happened had Kellogg not become such a prominent figure in the United States. In England, vegetarianism during this time period in the late 19th century and early 20th century remains highly politicized. So you have pacifists who adhere to a vegetarian diet. You have the working class remains committed to a vegetarian diet. It's promoted amongst the working classes because of this sort of economic equity idea. And then most importantly, you see a lot of really prominent suffragettes practicing a vegetarian diet in the United Kingdom during this time period. Now, some Battle Creek products make their way into England at the turn of the 20th century, and they are using meat substitutes, but they're not necessarily having this sort of massive kind of commercialization of vegetarianism that's occurring in the United States at the time. So kind of looking at the British model is sort of instructive in the ways in which maybe vegetarianism would have remained a politicized movement in the 20th century had Kellogg not gone the route that he did.
You've covered vegetarianism, which also covered women's rights and the anti-slavery movement and better economic equality and nonviolence. You've covered a lot, Adam, so what's next? What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, in some ways it's connected to my interests that popped up in vegetarian history, but we're moving away from food a little bit. I just very recently started researching, maybe prompted by looking at events in Kansas before the Civil War. I just started researching some other members of John Brown's abolitionist forces in the pre-state region. I have a particular interest in an individual by the name of August Bondy. Bondy is kind of interesting for a few reasons. One, he's one of a few Jewish members of Brown's forces in pre-state Kansas. But he also had been involved in the student revolutionary movement in Vienna in 1848. He immigrates to the United States soon afterwards. So I'm kind of interested in sort of sorting all of this out. What were Bondy's real sort of motivations to get involved in these events in Kansas? How does that connect to sort of the religious or social identities? And what were his experiences like in Europe that maybe also influenced his view of the Civil War, or at least the events that would eventually lead to the Civil War?
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and perhaps, where to send you those jeers or messages of support because of your love for the New York Yankees?
Well, we know that I will get an outpouring of emails from all the historically inclined Yankee fans out there. You can find me online. I have a website. It's vegetarianhistory.com. And I'd also invite everyone to follow me on Twitter. You can find me at VegHistory.
Adam, thank you so much for revealing the world of the vegetarian movement to us, because it has certainly been fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate it.
I don't know about you, but I'm disappointed by the fact that graham crackers are not graham bread. I mean, graham crackers sound like they taste way better than graham bread, but I have spent years thinking that graham crackers were an historic snack. Adam's discussion of the vegetarian movement reveals just how diverse the movement and its causes were. And I will admit that I was a bit surprised when Adam mentioned that John Harvey Kellogg helped promote the movement through commercialization. I suppose in hindsight I shouldn't have been that surprised, because I regularly buy my groceries at Whole Foods, which boasts many products aimed at vegetarians and the health conscious. You can find information about Adam, his book, The Vegetarian Crusade, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. benfranklinsworld.com/044. Did this episode make you hungry? Did you also think that graham crackers were an historic snack? Let me know by sending an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweeting me @Liz Covart, or leaving a post on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club. Wait, you aren't a member of Poor Richard's Club, the private Facebook community for history lovers and Ben Franklin's World listeners? You should join us. You can receive access to the club by texting BF World to 33444 right now.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.